The mercury hung at 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in the pre-dawn dark of the Montana Bitterroots. Silas Vane, a man who moved with the quiet economy of an engineer, checked his trapline. He was comfortable, his breathing placid. 3 miles down the canyon, the camp of Jedediah Stone was a scene of desperate, frantic activity. Stone, a veteran of 20 winters in these mountains, was fighting a losing war against the cold. His 12-ounce canvas wall tent was a fortress under siege. Inside, despite a roaring cast-iron stove consuming logs the size of a man's thigh, the temperature near the walls was 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Stone was exhausted, his days a cyclical hell of chopping the half-cord of wood required to simply not die. Silas, meanwhile, operated from a small, strange dome that looked like a silvered mound of snow. He had been out here for 3 weeks, and his total fuel consumption would not have kept Jed Stone's stove fed for a single night. For 4 days, Silas had been watched. A wild dog, its ribs a stark silhouette beneath a mangy coat, followed him. It never approached, keeping a precise, unnerving distance of 50 yards. It was starving, clearly, yet it made no attempt to raid his camp. It just watched. It watched him, it watched his traps, and most of all, it watched the strange, small shelter he called home. This animal, a creature of pure instinct, seemed to be studying a technical riddle. What did this lone inventor, dismissed as a book fool by the suppliers in Helena, understand about the physics of survival that generations of hardened frontiersmen had completely, fatally missed? The year was 1888. The Montana Territory was a raw, unforgiving land, transitioning violently from the era of the buffalo to the age of the railroad and the deep shaft mine. The easy fur had been trapped out decades before. To make a living, a man had to push higher into the alpine basins, enduring winters that didn't just kill, but systematically dismantled a man's will and his supplies. The established wisdom for survival in this environment was clear, etched into Army manuals and Hudson's Bay Company directives. It was a philosophy of mass. You built a heavy log lean-to, or you trusted the 65-pound duck canvas Sibley wall tent. You fought the cold with brute force, a massive, inefficient stove, and an even more massive expenditure of human energy to feed it. A man's life was measured by the ring of his axe and the height of his woodpile. This doctrine was accepted as gospel. It taught that the cold was an enemy to be assaulted with fire. It was a method that demanded a man spend 70% of his waking hours in the acquisition of fuel, tethering him to the thick-timbered valleys, far from the high-altitude ridges where the prime marten and silver fox ran. Silas Vane was a heretic. He carried no axe, only a small hatchet. His entire winter camp, stove included, weighed 42 pounds. The veterans at the trading post had watched him pack his strange, flimsy-looking gear. They saw the lightweight aluminum poles, the thin, shimmering fabric, and the tiny sheet metal stove that looked like a child's toy. They called his shelter Vane's Folly, and took bets on how many days it would be before he either froze or came crawling back for a real tent. But Vane believed the conventional wisdom was wrong. He believed survival was not about producing more heat, it was about losing less of it. He was betting his life on an equation. The failure of the traditional method was written across the landscape. One had only to look at the camp of Jedediah Stone. Stone was a textbook operator, a man who did everything by the book. His 10 by 12-foot canvas tent, purchased for $18.50 from the Sears Roebuck catalog, was the standard. It was pitched perfectly, guy lines taut. Inside, his cast-iron shepherd stove, a $4.50 model, glowed cherry red. But the system was a thermodynamic catastrophe. The heavy canvas was a single layer. It blocked the wind, but it offered an R-value of practically 0. The stove, with its wide-open grate, consumed 4-inch diameter logs in minutes, blasting 80% of its heat straight up the 6-inch stovepipe. Outside, the temperature was 20 degrees, 29 degrees. Inside, 6 inches from the stove, it was plus under 70 degrees, to 21 degrees C. 6 feet from the stove, it was plus 35 degrees, 1.6 degrees C. The result was a microclimate of misery. Stone's breath condensed on the canvas and froze, coating the entire interior in a quarter-inch of rime ice. This ice would melt slightly when he stoked the fire, dripping onto his blankets, only to refreeze when the fire died. He slept in 2-hour increments, a prisoner to the stove's appetite. He was constantly damp, constantly processing wood, and slowly his energy reserves were being depleted. He was not living in the wilderness. He was in a pitched battle with it, and he was losing. He would see the thin, lazy wisp of smoke from Vane's camp, a kilometre up the basin, and scoff. "Kids playin' house," he'd mutter to himself, splitting another log. Silas Vane was not a mountain man. He was a civil engineer, trained in Vermont, who had come west to survey routes for the Northern Pacific Railway. He was a man of calculations, stress loads, and gradients. His technical mind saw the world as a series of interacting systems. His knowledge of the frontier came not from law, but from tragedy. In the winter of 1883, his survey crew had been trapped by an early blizzard in the Idaho Panhandle. They had standard-issue Army Sibley tents. He watched 12 men, strong, capable men, freeze, suffer amputations, or die from exhaustion inside their shelters. They had axes, they had stoves, but they simply could not process wood fast enough to combat the overwhelming heat loss of their single-layer canvas coffins. During his recovery, Vane spent 6 months near a Salish reservation. He observed them not with the arrogance of a settler, but with the curiosity of an engineer. He noted their lodges, partially subterranean, were not heated by massive fires. They were layered with sod, hides, and woven mats. They understood the principle of the dead air space. He began obsessively reading. He read technical papers from British Arctic explorers like Nares and Nansen. He studied the physics of thermodynamics, conduction, convection, and radiation. He realized the frontier experts had it all wrong. They were trying to heat the outside world. He began sketching, applying his knowledge of bridge trusses and airflow. He devised a new system. When he presented his sketches to mining suppliers in Helena, they laughed him out of the office. "A tent made of silk, Vane. That's a lady's parlour dress, not a shelter for the Rockies." Silas ignored them. He used his savings to commission the components. He called it the Ethelred Thermal Shell. It was not a tent, it was a multi-layer shelter system. The first implementation was bizarre to onlookers. The skeleton was comprised of 12 interlocking hollow-cast aluminum poles, a new and expensive technology. They weighed 11 pounds and were incredibly strong. This frame formed a low, 7-foot diameter geodesic-like dome. Over this, he stretched the first layer, a fine oil-treated silk imported from Japan. It was completely waterproof, windproof, and shed snow instantly. It was also translucent, allowing him to work inside during the day without a lamp. This outer shell weighed 8 pounds. Inside, attached to the frame with 1-inch wooden toggles, was the second layer, panels of 1-inch thick wool batting sourced from a New England mill. This was the insulation, but the final layer was his genius. The interior lining was a fine canvas he had painstakingly painted with a mixture of silver powder, fish glue, and oil. It was a prototype radiant barrier. The floor was a heavy, rubberized canvas, sealed to the walls to create a tub, preventing ground moisture from entering and, more importantly, stopping cold air infiltration. The stove, which he called the Sipper, was made of 26-gauge sheet metal, weighed 4 pounds, and featured an airtight door and a 2-inch diameter pipe. Jedstone took 3 hours to set up his camp, which included felling 2 8-inch poles for his ridgeline. Silas could deploy the Ethelred shell in 45 minutes on any terrain. To Jed, it looked like a flimsy, silver mushroom. To Silas, it was a perfectly balanced thermal equation. The conflict was one of philosophy, a fundamental disagreement on the physics of heat. Jedediah Stone, like his forefathers, subscribed to the brute force method. The cold was an entity, a monster to be fought. You needed big logs, a big fire, and thick walls. You overwhelmed the cold with consumption. It was a philosophy of expenditure. Silas Vane, in contrast, followed the efficiency method. The cold was not a monster, it was a lack. It was the absence of heat. You do not fight a lack, you manage it. You cannot create infinite heat in the wilderness, but you can, with intelligent design, preserve the heat you have. This was a philosophy of containment. Silas's notebook was filled with the physics. He was attacking all three forms of heat loss. Conduction. His wool batting, layer 2, and the sealed floor stopped his heat from bleeding into the frozen ground or the canvas wall. Convection. The airtight Sipper stove didn't roar, it gently circulated warm air. The crucial 1.5-inch gap between the silk outer shell and the wool inner shell created a trapped, dead air space, the single greatest insulator. Radiation. This was the masterstroke. The silvered interior, layer 3, reflected 80% of all radiant heat, from the stove and from his own 98.6-degree body back at him. Jed's tent absorbed heat into the canvas and lost it to the wind. Silas's tent reflected heat back to its source. The battle was set. Jed, with his axe, was processing 150 pounds of wood a day. Silas, with his hatchet, was processing 15 pounds. The arrival of Mr. Davies provided the first objective data. Davies was a cartographer for the U.S. Geological Survey, a neutral, scientific observer camped a mile distant. He was meticulous, carrying a full weather kit, including a barometer, a sling psychrometer, and several calibrated thermometers. He was intrigued by the two opposing camps. It was Davies who first noted the persistent, starving dog that circled both camps but seemed to favor watching Vane. On the 3rd of January, a stable cold snap settled. Davies took his readings. At Jed Stone's camp, the outside air was 15-degree tough, 26-degree sassy. The interior temperature, 4 feet from the stove, was plus 138-degree Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius. The stove required stoking every 45 minutes. The humidity was over 90%, and Davies noted his own gloves stiffened with rime ice while he took notes. Fuel consumed in 8 hours, 32 pounds of lodgepole pine. He then proceeded to Vane's dome. Outside, 15 degrees Celsius. He unzipped the silk outer door, passed through the 1.5-inch air gap, and untoggled the wool inner flap. The entire 7-foot interior was a stable plus 165 degrees, 18 degrees C. Vane sat on his bedroll in his shirt sleeves, mending a snowshoe. The Sipper stove was barely warm to the touch. Fuel consumed in 8 hours, 5 pounds of dry aspen twigs. Davies's report, written that night, was one of professional shock. Vane's structure maintains an 80-degree F, 44°C temperature delta on approximately 1/6 the fuel load. The air is dry. The occupant is comfortable. It is baffling. That evening, Davies noted the wild dog, after observing both camps, curled up 30 yards from Silas's dome, sensing the structure's profound, inexplicable efficiency. The ethyl-red thermal shell was a system of layers, each with a discrete function. The outer silk shell was the weather barrier. It was non-porous. Snow and ice slid off, unlike canvas, which absorbed water, froze, and gained 30 pounds. It didn't stretch or shrink in the wet. It was essentially a perfect skin. The second layer, the 1.5-inch dead air gap, was the primary insulator. This was the principle the Salish understood, and the British Arctic explorers, and the birds in the trees. Air, when trapped, is the best insulator on Earth. It has almost no mass and cannot transfer heat via conduction. The failure of the Sibley tent was that its single wall was both skin and insulator, and failed at both. The third layer, the 1-inch wool batting, was the secondary insulator. Its job was to trap any heat that passed through the interior lining and to slow conduction from the aluminum poles. Its crucial property was that, unlike cotton or down, wool insulates even when damp. The fourth layer, the silvered radiant barrier, was the heat management system. It was the most important. Silas had read a paper on thermal radiation and had a revelation. Heating a tent was a fool's errand. One must heat the occupant. When Silas sat inside, the silver walls reflected his own body heat back at him. The tiny stove's radiant output was bounced around the interior, creating an even, dry warmth. Finally, the sipper stove. It was airtight. By limiting oxygen through a tiny intake valve, it forced the wood to gasify, to burn its own smoke. It was a high-efficiency wood gas stove, 50 years ahead of its time. It didn't burn wood, it distilled heat from it. On the 9th of January, the weather changed. A high-pressure system from the Gulf of Alaska, a Siberian Express, collided with a moist Pacific front. The temperature did not just drop, it fell off a cliff. By midnight, Davies's thermometer registered 42 degrees, 44 Fahrenheit, with a sustained 40-mile-per-hour wind. This was not a storm. This was a geological event. The wind chill was past, 80 degrees. At Jed Stone's camp, the brute force method failed. The 12-ounce canvas, stiff as iron, could not stop the convective force of the wind. The cold was pushed through the fabric. Jed's stove, roaring red-hot, was helpless. It was like trying to heat a colander. At 3 a.m., his woodpile, which he had thought was good for a week, was gone. The temperature inside his tent dropped to 10 degrees, 23 degrees C. He was trapped. He began burning his spare moccasins. In Silas's dome, the wind howled. The aerodynamic shape of the ethyl-red shell presented minimal resistance. The silk shuddered, but the frame was stable. Silas woke and adjusted the stove's air intake, increasing the airflow by a mere 10%. The sipper responded, its consumption rising to 1.5 pounds of twigs per hour. Outside, 42 degrees. Inside, the temperature held at a stable plus 162 degrees, 17 degrees C. He was not surviving, he was living. He made a cup of tea and recorded the barometric pressure in his journal. At 4 a.m., above the roar of the wind, he heard a new sound, a desperate, weak scratching at the silk outer door. It was the wild dog. Silas opened the outer flap. The wind tore at him, but the inner dead air space held. The dog, a female, was a sculpture of ice. She collapsed at his feet, her body shaking violently. She didn't look at him with gratitude. She looked past him, into the silvered, warm interior. She whimpered, a sound of agony. Silas, assuming she wanted shelter, tried to pull her in, but she resisted. She crawled, not to the stove, but toward his pack. She nudged it, then staggered back to the door. She tried to stand, stumbled, and looked back into the blackness of the blizzard, whining. He understood. She was not asking for shelter for herself. She was showing him the shelter worked, and now she was asking him to move it. He realized what was happening. He packed the sipper stove, still warm, into its metal box, grabbed a blanket, and put on his outer gear. He followed the dog. She led him, crawling, half a mile into the teeth of the gale, into a rockfall at the base of a cliff. There, under a granite overhang, shielded from the wind but not the cold, were 3 pups, no more than a few weeks old. They were nearly frozen, piled together, barely breathing. This was the why. The dog, a wild creature, had been watching him for days. She wasn't begging for food. She was scouting technology. She had seen the failure of Jed's camp and the success of his. She had identified his portable, high-efficiency warmth as the only thing that could save her family. Silas Vane, the cold Vermont engineer, stood in the blizzard and wept. He wept for her intelligence, for her desperation, and for the realization of what his work meant. He couldn't move the pups, but he could move the ethyl red. He stumbled back, fetched his 40-pound shelter and set it up over the pups in 20 minutes. He lit the stove. Within 10 minutes, the interior was 50 degrees. The pups began to stir. The mother dog, her energy gone, crawled in and began licking them, her eyes fixed on Silas. When the storm broke 36 hours later, Silas, the mother dog, and her pups were alive and well. He left them with a supply of wood and jerky and went to find Jed Stone. He found him alive, but only just. Stone had burned his spare blankets and the wooden crate for his traps. His feet were severely frostbitten. He was delirious. Silas and Mr. Davies, the USGS cartographer, hauled him to Vane's base camp. As Stone thawed in the 65-degree warmth of the Folly, he stared at the silver walls, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who has seen a ghost. I was burning a forest," Stone whispered, his voice cracked. You were sipping twigs." Davies documented it all. The failure of the canvas tent, the frostbite, the precise fuel consumption of the Ethelred shell, and, in a detailed appendix, the canine incident. His official report, Comparative Analysis of Thermal Efficiencies in Alpine Shelters, was sent to Helena and Washington, D.C. The suppliers in Helena, upon reading Davies's data, stopped laughing. The U.S. Army at Fort Shaw, which was losing more men to cold weather accidents than to conflict, requested an immediate demonstration. Jed Stone, after recovering, though he would lose 2 toes, became Vane's most vocal advocate. He refused to go into the mountains again without what he called a reflex cache tent. The Ethelred shell, which had cost Silas $120 to build, was suddenly in demand. The first production models, sold for $150, were snapped up by high-altitude miners and surveyors, men whose lives depended on efficiency. By 1895, the U.S. Geological Survey had adopted a modified version of the Ethelred thermal shell for all high-altitude winter operations. When the Klondike Gold Rush began in 1896, thousands of men hauled their 100-pound canvas tents over the Chilkoot Pass, condemning themselves to a life of labor just to stay warm. But a few hundred, who had paid the premium for a Vane-type shelter, were able to travel lighter, set up camp faster, and spend their energy prospecting, not chopping wood. Silas Vane never became a rich man. He was an engineer, not an industrialist. He stayed in the Bitterroots, refining his designs. The mother dog, which he named Ethelred, Old English for noble counsel, and one of her pups, Sipper, stayed with him. The legacy was not the silk or the aluminum. Those materials would be replaced. The legacy was the idea. The frontier was not conquered by brute force, but by understanding its laws. It was not about a man's strength against the cold. It was about a man's intelligence in managing heat. The wilderness, Silas wrote in his final journal, is not cruel. It is merely honest. It rewards not stubbornness, but adaptation, and sometimes it takes the desperate, calculated observation of a starving mother to prove a revolution in how humanity endures.